As I mentioned before, the write zone can have as many as 6 individual tabs, but you can access the most important ones here at the top of the window. And I'm going to go through each one of these. There's the VST Instrument tab, which has the settings for all of the different track instruments and rack instruments. The track instruments appear above this little delineator, and the rack instruments will show up below that. Since we don't have any rack instruments right now, we're only looking at that one instance of our virtual instrument, Halion-Sonic SE, and it is above the track instrument delineator. Then if we go to the Media tab, this is where it gets really interesting, because here we can load all of our different VST instruments, effects, loops and samples, and all of the other different media types that come with Cubase. And there's a bunch of it. So getting into this media section, we're going to do a little bit more of later. But if we were to go into loops and samples and look at all of these different libraries and then look at the different libraries that are inside or the different patches that are inside of each library, we can kind of get into the weeds here very quickly. So it's important to know that if you do find yourself kind of lost in this landscape of different media, you can click the little home icon and that will take you back to the very start of the media browser. Then the CR tab is for Control Room, and I strongly recommend that you get used to using the Control Room because it offers a lot of really nice features. So let's click on Control Room, but you'll notice that unless you've already configured the Control Room, it's disabled. So you can enable it right here, but let me show you what's going on in the background. If we come over to the Studio pull-down menu and go to Audio Connections, the keyboard shortcut for that is F4. And if we look at the Outputs tab, what we would normally have here if the Control Room was disabled, which I'll just turn off for right now, disable it. If we look at the outputs, typically by default, the output setting is going to be the first pair of audio outputs on your audio interface. But the Control Room overtakes those two settings, the left and the right output. Unless you're in a surround sound, then you'd have 6 settings, or a 2.1 setting, you'd have 3. But it's going to take those first pair of stereo outputs in a stereo project and send them to the Control Room instead. So when we come to Control Room here and power it up with this little button, then it's going to assign our main left and right outputs as the Control Room output. And then when we go back to the Outputs tab, you'll see that the stereo output has been disconnected. And that is normal. That's how you configure the Control Room to use the proper outputs or the preferred pair of outputs on your audio interface. So I'll close that Audio Connections window and let's just take a look at some of the things here. There are different channels for the outputs to show you your different speaker configurations. There are also downmix presets so that you can listen to things both in stereo and in mono or any other audio configuration. If I close that tab, we're going to come down here to my favorite feature, which is the Control Room volume knob. And this allows you to control your studio monitor output without changing the stereo output fader. If you have the stereo output fader down, your mix down is going to be very quiet. So almost always you're going to leave the stereo output control at 0, but then to adjust your listening level, you can use the Control Room knob right here. You also have things like the click track volume level, which is a very important thing, as well as where that click is panned, either left or right. You have some talkback settings as well, and those are all found in the Control Room tab. Then there's the meter, and there's a lot of different ways to look at the output level of Cubase on this meter. The default is the plus 3 dB digital scale, but you can switch that to a whole bunch of different standards, including all of the Bobcat's K system settings like K20 or K14, K12, and so forth. There's also the Nordic scale, the British scale, and so forth. And you'll see that meter as long as these other 2 tabs down here at the bottom are set to master. If you click on the loudness tab, then what you're looking at is a loudness meter, and loudness is how you measure the actual perceived volume level of a project. And so this comes in real handy when you're working either in a mix or during mastering. But if you just want to be able to see your standard meter, then you can come back to the Master tab, and you can get to that meter anytime by clicking on the Meter tab in the Write Zone. And one of my favorite views in the Write Zone, especially if I'm working on a single monitor setup, is to have it on the Meter tab, as well as enabling the Control Room. That gives you a shorter version of that meter, but it also shows you the most common controls in the Control Room itself. So having the CR turned on in meter mode is kind of like having the meter and the control room visible at the same time. And next, let's talk about the lower zone.